the idea to waive rules of the WTO's trade-related aspects of intellectual property, or TRIPS agreement, and that's to potentially increase supplies of vaccines, seems to be simple, but some experts say its benefits are not necessarily so clear. So what do we make of this? Joining us now for perspective on the subject in terms of the barriers to access and intellectual property are our guests. Patrick Durish is a health policy expert at Swiss NGO Public Eye, Pharmaceuticals Made in South Africa chair, and Aspen executive Dr. Stavlas Nicolaou, Section 27 legal researcher Baumi Twala, and Stephen Ezell, director of Global Innovation Policy and the Information Technology and Information Foundation. Quite a mouthful to all our guests. Thanks very much indeed for your time. It's great to be chatting to you here on Newsroom Channel 405. I wonder if we can just begin by unpacking, Patrick, what we actually mean when we ask for these regulations to be lifted. In layman's terms, what does that actually allow people to do?
Well, intellectual property has a lot of different things, patents, copyright, industrial designs, some aspects of trade secrets as well. So if we're talking about waiving the intellectual property, it means that you open up the game and you allow other producers to start fabricating COVID-19 health tools, which is very much needed because this would give much more supply options. We are seeing, because of the inequitable distribution of these COVID vaccines, that some countries are lagging behind, South Africa being one of them, while high-income countries have already are very much advanced in their vaccination campaigns. So there is an inequity there, and this is due to a shortage of supply. If we had more supply, we could deliver more doses everywhere at the same time.
Right. Perhaps I got ahead of myself. Let me just begin with opening statements around the central question, and that is whether or not you believe that, in fact, intellectual property are the bottlenecks for the supply. Patrick, I got your sense in your response. Bauni, let me bring that question to you. Are IP rules what's stopping us from distributing vaccines equitably?
Thanks, Ayanda. I would say that IP laws are currently skewed in favor of pharmaceutical companies at the expense of people's right to access to medicine, which has implications on the right to health and consequently the right to life, dignity, equality. I think what the COVID-19 pandemic has done is simply brought this systematic public health issue into the public eye. And what we need to do is realize that it is not unique to the current pandemic. It's something that has been ongoing and will continue unless we can correct this imbalance and kind of improve people's access to medicine. And it can only prove beneficial to pharmaceutical companies. Everyone should be happy all around.
Stephen, how do you see it?
So, India and South Africa submitted their petition for the COVID-19 TRIPS waiver to the TRIPS Council on October 2nd, 2020. And as the very petition itself acknowledged, quote, to date, there is no vaccine or medicine to effectively prevent or treat COVID-19. Why then was there any kind of need to waive intellectual property rights for technologies and innovations that didn't even exist at the time? It just shows that intellectual property rights have never been a barrier to access in the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, they've been essential to the creation of the COVID-19 vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics we need to solve the problem. And they've also been vital to the types of partnerships that have facilitated the scaling of COVID-19 vaccine and therapeutic manufacturing with contract manufacturers across the world.
Dr. Nicolaou, let's get your take on this.
Yeah, and firstly, thanks for having me on your program. I think I'm going to kick off by just citing one very telling statistic at the moment, and then I'll give you what the South African pharmaceutical industry position is. Currently, 2.3 billion doses of COVID vaccines have been administered globally, and less than 20 million of those have found their way into African arms. So there's no doubt that there is this inequality that exists. And the best way to solve it, because this is not a new debate, the IP debate is not a new debate. We went through this with HIV, to an extent with multi-drug resistant TB, and we were able to solve it taking a more practical approach. And our position is we need to be more practical around these solutions. IP is one facet of it. The real issue here is getting technologies and technology partnerships to build capacity on the continent, and through that capacity to ensure a greater equality of the distribution of whether it's vaccines or any other pharmaceutical for that matter. Whether it's HIV we were looking at and we solved it 15 years ago, or whether we're faced with new pandemics now as we are here today. So we would be saying a practical approach is the best approach to solve the problem.
Yeah. I wonder what that then looks like then, Patrick. I mean, a well-rehearsed argument is that lifting of IP regulations is a disincentive for creativity and innovation. It's a sentiment in some respects expressed by Stephen. Does that hold water in the context of what we're experiencing now? I mean, is it more of a priority not to mess up the process of creativity, or should the objective rather be to ensure that, again, vaccines are as equitably distributed as possible, given what we're seeing across the world?
Well, for me, in such a global crisis, it doesn't hold water, and I would challenge what Stephen and Stavros just said. First, we have a vaccine in a short time, which is quite a remarkable achievement, because there was a lot of public funding being thrown at the table. And this is really what triggered the whole process. I don't think it's intellectual property that allowed quick development of the vaccines. It's scientific collaboration, but for this you don't need necessarily patents. So I think there's been more than $100 billion just in 2020 that has been injected for COVID-19 vaccines, therapeutics, or tests. So I think this is the real incentive. And remember, at the beginning of the crisis, there were a lot of head of states. We had no vaccines, we had no treatments, we had no tests, or just the first ones. And they said, basically, whatever comes out with this public funding should be a public good and a common good. And what we're seeing today is that intellectual property is de facto privatizing what should be a public good. And this forbids other producers, and there are many idle capacities around the world that would be able to produce vaccines, treatments, or diagnostic tests. So yes, it is a major obstacle.
Right. And depending on who you speak to, Baune, I mean, even the funding around COVID-19 vaccines, according to some people, renders those products public goods. I mean, we remember when the outbreak began, how there had been just such an outpouring of support, in some instances even from government. How then do we justify what is, to some people, a public good being used potentially now for profits by keeping these IPs in place?
I think it's definitely not justifiable. I completely agree with Patrick. I think also, to respond to what Stephen had said earlier, the TRIPS waiver would be limited in scope and time. And so it wouldn't necessarily apply to all medicines for an unlimited time. It would be for a very limited time and only limited to COVID-19 technologies and therapies, as well as medicines. So it should not discourage innovation or creativity, because it's limited to a very specific illness, specific related medicines. And so I would disagree that it would be a discouragement. I also think that the impact of access to COVID-19 medicines and technologies far outweighs current discussions that we're having about whether or not this should be limited to certain private benefits. One of the things we've seen from COVID-19 vaccines and how corporations and certain individuals have benefited from that is that so many people have become billionaires because of the money that they've made from selling these vaccines, whereas to fund them and to create them was a collaborative effort.
Yeah. Stephen, of course, the guiding principle should be ensuring that there's an equitable distribution of vaccines. That's perhaps a good starting point where we all do agree. The question then becomes, why isn't that happening?
Well, the fundamental challenge here is not intellectual property rights. It is the ability to scale manufacturing globally of the needed COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics. And that's the fundamental issue. I think we're all on the same page with that. And listen, innovative companies within less than a year had a vaccine to a new virus that had never existed before, right? So we had to invent the vaccine and therapeutics from scratch. And now we have to invent the manufacturing capacity at a global scale to produce the vaccines we need. And then, of course, ensure that they're equitably distributed around the world. We are on our way to doing this, right? We got 2.5 billion vaccines produced so far. On the current projections for 2021 alone, expected to get to 11 to 12 billion vaccines, right? So the system is working. The 300 international partnerships that now exist between innovative companies and contract manufacturers across the world, from South Africa to Egypt, Pakistan, Brazil, and Argentina. These are scaling the medicines we need, right? That's the challenge now. And then the challenge is going to become to ensure that across the developed and developing world alike, the public health infrastructure exists in these nations to get the shots into arms that needs them. We're already seeing this as a challenge in Africa, and this is where policymakers need to be focused, not on waiving intellectual property rights, but on manufacturing the vaccines and ensuring that they can get in the arms of citizens around the world who need them.
Yeah, Dr. Nicolau, Stephen is expressing the opinion that it's not really about IPs, it's a matter of scale. In fact, part of the sentence that he said that stuck with me is the system is working. Even in isolation, does that resonate with you? Does that sound accurate?
Look, Ayanda, IP is just one part of the equation. So let me be clear also in response to Patrick's earlier comments. I can give you my IP tomorrow morning. Okay, not that I own it, but supposing I did. If you don't have the technical capacity, if you don't have the skills, if you don't have the know-how, if you don't have any of that, it doesn't mean much, right? I mean, let's accept that as a principle. And that is why I'm saying what's more important. IP is one step in the process. But what we have to do regionally and locally, if we are to get health security and security of supply to our people, is we need two things that are critical. These are the practical elements I'm discussing. Because I know we went through this with HIV and we solved it using a particular model. We're suggesting a very similar model here. Number one, Africa needs technologies, either through technology transfers or technology partnerships. Technology transfers include transferring the technologies, the know-how, skills transfer, etc. And then the second thing we need sustainable volumes to underpin manufacturing on the continent. It's no use putting up facilities. I give you my IP and you put up a facility and there's no sustainable volume because the procurement is happening through multilateral fora. You're not going to have sustainable volumes on the continent. So the practical things I'm talking about is technology transfers, and we need a reconfiguration or reorientation of the global procurement dynamics so that we have volume throughput on the continent to sustain our own capacities. And I think those are the two most critical elements in this discussion.
The time we had was never going to be completely enough. I'm hoping what has been said so far is enough to at least pique an interest and have people discover a bit more. For now, I have to thank you for your time. I actually can't believe it myself. But Dr. Stravlas Nicolau, Patrick Durish, Stephen Ezell, and Baumne Twala, to all of you once again, thanks very much indeed for your time.